Awesome. Should we talk about some JavaScript or something?
No.
Yeah. No. Okay. All right. So my talk today is going to be on Ember.js and the ecosystem. So I just kind of want to give like a kind of broad 5,000-foot view of the framework, and then also some of the kind of cool stuff that is unique about Ember. So first things first, that's me learning how to use Snapchat filters. You can find me on the internet in various places, both GitHub and Twitter. Those are my usernames. I live in Minneapolis. I work in place in St. Paul. These are my Minnesotan bona fides. Please don't question them. And then I work for a company called IR Health, which is based in Boston. We are a healthcare startup that is restoring humanity to healthcare. We operate a number of primary care clinics throughout the United States and are doing some pretty cool stuff. At engineering at IRO, we kind of do everything from the back-end API stuff to the front-end, building a lot of single-page apps. And my favorite thing about working for a company in Boston is I get to go to Dunkin' Donuts every quarter, which is great. I want to start off by going back in time a little bit, specifically to 2013. In 2013, I sort of started out building single-page apps using framework that probably most of you guys are familiar with, which is Angular, specifically Angular 1. I know there's another one now, but I've never used it, and I don't know what it's like. But Angular 1 was kind of like where I got my teeth in the JavaScript world. So Angular was awesome. Like it kind of changed the game in 2013 and allowed for, it had two-way data binding and stuff like that, and you could kind of create these rich UIs without the use of like a bunch of jQuery plugins that you're kind of like stitching together, and ended up with spaghetti code at the end. And it was awesome. So I built some single-page apps in Angular for about 3 years. And then in 2016, I ended my friendship with Emberjs when I started working for Iora and discovered my new best friend, Emberjs. So what is Emberjs? So Emberjs is a batteries included convention-based framework that's driven by the community, and it's a framework for getting shit done, which as a software engineer I think is like probably the most important thing, is that we're getting stuff done. But if you ask Tom Dale, he might describe it as being bespoke, artisanal, and shade-grown, which I think is interesting. So I want to dive a little bit into sort of where Ember came from. First, can I get a show of hands? Like, Ember's been out for a while, and I just kind of want to see, like, does anyone have experience with Ember in the last like 5 years? All right, okay, that's actually more than I actually expected, so that's awesome. Ember kind of has these really early roots as being a single-page app framework. It kind of goes back to like the beginning of single-page apps almost. So about 10 years ago, there's a framework called Sprout Core, which the big notable use for it was inside of Apple being used to build things like MobileMe, the web-based client for that. So things like MobileMe email on the web and the iPhoto app on the web. And it was kind of game-changing for the time. Like this is like 2 years after Gmail came out and was like this cool Ajax mail client, and here's Sprout Core powering all these cool, JavaScript apps before, like even smartphone apps were really that ubiquitous. And so it was based around like this idea of widgets, kind of similar to the widgets that are in, if you're writing like a Mac OS app, and you think about all the little Cocoa API widgets. You have your like text area or your tab window or something like that. So it was very much based around that. And while it was great, like if you look at this code here, it's kind of like it's very much rooted in this idea of the way that apps were built on the desktop, and didn't really mirror very well like how the web works as a platform. So it mapped to the DOM, right? But you can see like there's a lot of stuff around like absolute positioning and stuff like that that just wasn't like web native. And so what happened is that as Sprout Core got older, they started talking more about what's Sprout Core 2.0 going to look like. And what happened was essentially they came up with all these ideas for what Sprout Core 2 would be, and decided that, let's just make a new framework out of this. So Sprout Core 2 was sort of forked and became the first version of Ember.js. So from about 2011 to 2015, Ember.js was this kind of a step out of the old world, step into the new world, and kind of a sibling to Angular 1.0. So like leveraged a lot of things like two-way binding, kind of this more MVC approach, so a lot of controllers. It did actually have something called views, which were sort of a wrapper around UI functionality, but they kind of like got context from everywhere. So whatever controllers were above the views, they were getting whatever data was in there, and it was pretty hard to tell like what data was going into what. And it had a lot of sort of vestigial Sprout Core constructs, so it was still very widget-oriented in some ways. Towards the later versions of Ember 1, we started to get things like components, but early on it was very much based around kind of these widgets and MVC, Cocoa-inspired APIs, that have their drawbacks. And then in 2015, Ember kind of went through another sort of transformation with Ember 2, which was, they kind of looked at what was going on in the rest of the JavaScript world. Things like React were really starting to kind of blow up, and the idea of, more performant web apps and kind of more ambitious applications, that needed to have, a little bit more power to them. Was emerging, and so Ember 2 kind of like took those ideas and integrated them into the Ember framework, and sort of shed a bunch of the legacy that they were sort of still carrying around that was preventing them from moving on to bigger things. So Ember 2 was when they introduced virtual DOM based rendering, and then in the last 6 months they've introduced virtual machine powered rendering, which is really awesome, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and kind of focuses more on components and kind of throwing out some of the older MVC stuff. And then there's also been a few other, a couple things that have come out of Ember as a framework that are pretty cool and kind of different from what some of the other frameworks are doing, just because it is a more batteries included kind of experience. So it was one of the first frameworks probably to have a CLI tool for it. Kind of predates Create React App and things like that, and has generators for code, so you can get like a new component started quickly with some stubbed out tests. It has a test runner built into it, so you don't have to set up all that yourself. Build tool integration, so like you don't have to mess around with whatever packing strategy you're going to use for your JavaScript assets, and whatever CSS preprocessor or God forbid Babel. So it's got all that kind of built in, and that just comes with the framework for free. And it's also got an add-on system, which is super powerful, and will kind of be the focus of the second half of the talk. And then on the other side is just like something I think is really technically interesting, which is Glimmer 2, which is the sort of rendering layout engine that underpins the current modern versions of Ember. And it's based on this like stack machine that runs inside of your browser. That's really cool, and it's got some of the fastest DOM updates in the game, and the like really minor benchmarks that don't mean anything in the real world, but they're kind of cool. And they actually extracted that rendering engine to its own component library that you can use like standalone, like you would React or something like that, called Glimmer.js. So you should check that out if you're interested. But let's kind of get on to the fundamentals of Ember, because that's kind of the interesting stuff, right? So Ember apps are made of a few kind of base elements, routes and controllers, and I'll talk about why that's in parentheses, components, helpers, services, sweat, tiers, usual software stuff. But also, it's got this kind of weird thing called Ember Object that I'm going to explain a little bit about because it will make the rest of the framework make a little sense. And this is kind of one of the last sort of vestiges of Sprout core that kind of exists in Ember today. So basically what Ember Object is this sort of, so Ember kind of came out when JavaScript was like, I think ES3. So it predates a lot of the really nice stuff that we have in JavaScript today. So this was before classes existed in JavaScript. This was before, well, I mean, classes exist, but before the nice syntax for classes existed. And so there's sort of some machinery around this to make certain things possible. So essentially the way that it works is you have an Ember object, and you extend that object, and you add properties to it. And instead of accessing an object the regular way that you would in JavaScript, with dot property accessors, you instead do it through these .get and .set functions. Not too different from a regular object, but important to think about when you look through the rest of the talk, because a lot of the code you'll sort of see these gets and sets, and you might wonder kind of what they're corresponding to. And then one other cool thing that's baked into Ember objects is this computed concept. So these are properties that are dependent on other properties. So essentially what that means is that it attaches a listener to whatever those dependent properties are, and it will sort of update that computed property whenever those change. So essentially underneath what's happening is the first time you access the property, it'll compute it, and then it'll store that value. It'll cache it within it, so that the next time you do a get, it won't actually have to recompute. And then when whatever property it's based on changes, it'll just blow away that cache, and then the next time that you use it or access it, it'll do the recomputation. And so that's like extremely powerful, and it's very performant. And it's honestly, it's one of the best things about Ember, because it really removes a lot of complexity around managing state changes and stuff like that. So the first kind of high-level thing I want to talk about in Ember is routes. So if you've been building JavaScript apps, you're probably familiar with the concept of routing on the front end, and they're responsible for getting you where you need to go, or getting your users where they need to go. So routes in Ember are responsible for the URL. They're primarily responsible for loading data. So like most of the data that you have in your apps, you probably want to be loading in a route. It's probably going to correspond to a resource. And you can nest them, so you can have like a main route for, say, blog posts, and then you can have a route within that that's the index that'll list all the blog posts, and then have like a show route underneath that will list a single blog post, and data might be cached between those two, and you can switch between them pretty quickly, which ends up being very powerful. And then kind of the second responsibility of routers is setting up a controller, which essentially is just responsible for rendering kind of the top level part of the page. So if you look on the right there, the code, or yeah, the right, the code sample there is, that's essentially what most routes look like. It's usually two functions, model and setup controller. And hopefully setup controller will eventually not be needed. But that brings me to my other point, which is controllers, which I sort of consider to be the route's gallbladder, because you can usually get by without them. And there's sort of another one of these like vestigial things from Sprout Core that are kind of going away. And so essentially what controllers are is they're just like the glue between routes and whatever template that the route controls. So it's sort of the way for your components and your kind of visual UI logic to talk to the state that the page is in right there. So like if I click on a link, that needs to go up the chain of command, and it needs to go to a route, and the route needs to go, OK, I'm navigating. So controllers, the reason why they're sort of vestigial is they're typically created implicitly by the route these days. So if you saw that setup controller function inside of the route in the previous example, that is essentially doing the stuff that's setting up a generated controller. So it's like it's setting the data on that controller, and all the controller is doing is passing that data into a template, and then that template is rendering. So hopefully one day they won't be necessary. If you have time to read some RFCs, you can do a popular internet search engine search for Ember routable components. And maybe one day when you Google that, internet search that, it'll actually show you something that has been completed. So the next kind of big piece of the framework I want to talk about is components. And as you can expect, they're mostly like components in every other component library. So if you built a React component, if you built a Angular, does the new Angular have components? Yeah? OK, yeah. Vue, I think, does, right? Yeah? OK. So yeah, it's like everything else you've used. Components represent little pieces of UI. And they operate on an isolated context, so you have to pass data in as attributes into that component for that component to know about that data. And then they've got lifecycle hooks for doing different things, like plugging in whatever jQuery extension that your app still has to depend on, and that kind of thing. And then they can respond to actions from child components. So that's that idea of data down, actions up. So if you do a click in your component, that's going to bubble up, and so you can handle it. Yeah. So the other sort of atom of Ember that has a place in the template is helpers. And so essentially what there are is they're just functions that you can use in your templates. You just give them data, and then they produce a result. They're pure functions. They have no access to your application state. Don't try to pass stuff into your helpers that's application state. You can do it. It's very bad. Don't do it. It's very funny that it works, though. So do it for fun, and then don't do it again. They're composable, which is really, really cool and hugely powerful. So if you look at the code sample here on the right, I've got like this use. There's a helper called component, and you can give it the name of a component, and that name can be like essentially a variable that's in your template. So you can sort of plug pieces. You can compose components of other components. So for instance, this week I wrote a table component, and I want to be able to stub out like the table body either with like groups of table rows or just like plain old straight table rows. And so I use the component helper to inject which component I want into it based on when I use it. And if there are any functional programming fans in the audience, it is essentially like using Lisp in your application templates, which is great if you like parentheses. But how does it all tie together? I just kind of like threw a bunch of stuff at you, but I haven't shown you anything about how you would actually use it other than some contrived examples. So let's use a different contrived example. So this is a little very, very contrived example I made, which is an app called What's Good, and it shows you a list of things that I think are good. And I don't know if you can see any of the text of that in the back, which is unfortunate because there's some good stuff on there. But as you can see, it's a very simple app that's composed of a couple of components and essentially 1 or 2 routes, I think I did. And if I was on my actual machine, I would show you how this works. But unfortunately, USB-C is not working out so well. So let's look at some code. If you're in your browser, you go to /what's-good. You want to find out what's good, specifically what I think is good. And so the first thing your app is going to do is it's going to hit this router.js, or it's going to match with a route that's specified in your router.js. And so what that's going to do is the router is going to look at that URL, and it's going to say, hey, I've got a route that matches that URL. Awesome. So then it's going to fire off this route here. And so this route has a model function. And that model function, all it does is it makes a request to an API, makes a request to the good things API to get all of the good things. And then it's going to return those good things. And then that route has a template that has a 1-line helper in it that just says outlet. And what that means is everything else is going to go inside of that outlet. So if you think about plugging in an extension cable into the wall, you're putting stuff into that template. And so if you recall that routes are nested and can be nested. So here we hit the top level what's good route. And Ember, because it's a convention-based framework, knows that like, oh, I don't have a slash after this. I'm going to go to the index route within that route. So that is going to load up this other route that's nested inside of that. And that is going to be a very simple route that just essentially returns the data from above. But the interesting part is the template. So the template here is getting rendered into that outlet from the previous template. And we're seeing that it has a header that says what's good. And then it's also calling out to a component called the good things list. And we're passing the good things into the good things list. And then inside of that good things list, so that's essentially acting as like a loop over each of the good things. So if you've programmed in Ruby, you might recognize this kind of block syntax. It's very similar. So we're looping over the good things, and we're rendering another component called the good things list item. And we're passing whatever good thing we have into that list item. And then at the end, it just says, thank you, excellent people who make and do good things. So let's take a look at the good things list. So the good things list is an object. It's an Ember object that extends something called the Ember component. And so that's just the component class responsible for rendering components. And we've just set a couple properties on here. We've set a computed property called number of good things. And that is based on the array of good things. So anytime a good thing is added or removed from that list, that computed property will be updated. And so what this computed property returns is the length of the list of good things, so that we can use just number of good things in the templates and know how many good things we have. And then there's another computed property that is also dependent on the list of good things called sorted good things. And this uses something in Ember called computed property macros, which are sort of like common patterns for doing computed properties. So there's a bunch of them. But one of the ones that's really useful is the computed.sort macro, which just allows you to give it a list and then give it sort of the rules for sorting. And so here we're depending on the list of good things, and we're sorting it by the name of the good thing in ascending order. And that is, so the good things list has a template below, which you can see does an each loop, and it's actually responsible for rendering out the list items and yielding that block, or yielding a good thing. So essentially that's saying, go back up the template and do whatever else is there. And so that's what's up here in the previous template, allowing for us to use that good thing list item inside of there. And so after that, so we've got this list that renders list items, and inside of that, it's going to render that good things list item that we passed into it before. And so you can see here, it's it's got a strong tag with the link to the specific good thing if you want to look at the details of that 21-year-old scotch. And then it also has a description of that 21-year-old scotch. And then that template calls out to the titleize helper, which you can see up above in the arrow pointing up. It says, you can just see a function. It's getting a list of parameters. The first parameter we're giving it is text. So we're just taking that text and titleizing it. And so very, very simple, straightforward helper. So that's kind of like how it all ties together. That's sort of the rendering cycle for a single route in Ember.js. But I haven't actually told you how to create an Ember.js application, which might be mildly confusing. So here's how to create an Ember application. So once again, we have that Ember CLI tool that comes with Ember. And with it, it just has a new command that you can use to give it the name of your app. I use yarn, so I use pass in -- yarn, and you will get a brand new Ember application with a number of default components and routes and add-ons and stuff added to it. So what's next? We're going to take a look at the Ember ecosystem, which I think is the really probably the best part about Ember. So Ember, once again, has this concept of add-ons. So you can essentially write Ember install name of add-on, and it'll go out to the internet. It'll fetch whatever npm package is named whatever you gave it, and we'll install it into your app. And Ember will load that, and you can sort of utilize all of these other packages that other developers have made and kind of supercharge your application pretty quickly. So the first one I want to talk about is Ember Concurrency. And Ember Concurrency is the coolest thing ever. And I don't mean that lightly. I've literally tweeted, I would like to marry Ember Concurrency. It just makes a whole host of problems just fade away into the ether. So essentially, what Ember Concurrency is it's a primitive for doing asynchronous work management. So if you're writing an application, you might have a number of asynchronous things that happen. You're probably sending requests to APIs. You might be doing sort of flows in the UI that depend on certain other actions, and kind of managing all of this can be kind of complicated. You might create temporary variables that are is _ something running, right? Or have I done this yet? And with Ember concurrency tasks, it kind of gets rid of all that machinery for you. So you can do things like debouncing really easily. You can restart operations really easily. You can cancel AJAX requests, which I think if you want to do that, right now in most of the libraries, you have to actually use an XML HTTP request object directly, and it's terrible. And you can restrict the number of times that an operation can run. So that's super powerful for if you have a button that says, when I click this button, I'm going to pay $50 to this website. you don't want people clicking that a bunch of times and racking up a bunch of money. Well, you might want that, but you shouldn't do that. And so this makes it easy to prevent that from happening. And then kind of one of the things that I think is we don't pay enough attention to when writing apps, especially on the front end, is handling errors and gracefully recovering from those errors. So if you think about like back-end systems, there's a lot of work that goes into building in resiliency and stuff into your app. So like the network goes down, something like that, those back-end applications recover. So we should be able to do the same thing with our front-end applications, right? So if something happens loading data for like a small section of your application, you don't want your whole app to crash. You don't want the user to have to do a complete full reload because they might be on a really slow connection, they might be on a smartphone. If there are solar flares going on, like you don't want them to have to like continuously reload, right? So having something built into your application to allow you to like catch those errors and then retry them without your user knowing anything that happened is really, really powerful. So this is one of the add-ons that I use that I install in every application that I build in Ember, just because it's very, very powerful. So you can see on the right, I've got a sample for how to do this. So essentially, you just wrap a generator function in this task. And so it uses generator functions because you can essentially you can yield within those functions a promise. And what the task will do is it'll wait for that promise to resolve before it continues doing any of the next steps. And if your component gets destroyed or it leaves the page or something like that, it'll just kind of black hole the whole thing. It won't do the rest of the task. Your users won't see any errors because that component has gone off the page or whatever, and you don't want to be bothering them with kind of the technical what's going on underneath. So I've just got this task here for hacking the mainframe, which is a common thing that is done in front-end JavaScript applications. So like if we started scanning for vulnerable hosts on the network, and then suddenly like we had to close the window because there's a police officer walking by or something, like you wouldn't want everything to blow up and start spewing stuff in your error logs and stuff like that. So the task just kind of like implodes on itself. And for some reason, we only want to be hacking 3 mainframes at once, which is why we set the max concurrency to 3. And then anything else after that just kind of drops off, and we don't know about it. This is kind of a more put together example for how you use this in an app. So let's say you have a button, and it's the Pay Me Money button. And there's a number of things that can happen when paying a website money. So you're using Stripe or something, and for some reason Stripe says you can't pay that little of money. I need more money, and so it'll handle that error, and your user won't know anything went wrong, even though it threw an exception. And instead, you give your user the chance to like retry that. So Ember Concurrency tasks keep track of how many times they've been run. They keep track of like what was the last result that that was returned from this task function, and so you can use that in your UI to render things like is this task running? Like I should show a loading spinner. Did this task not complete successfully? Did it error out? Oh, I should tell the user that like, oh, this errored out. Click me again to try again. And then on the flip side, you can also get the last sort of successful invocation of that function and get whatever the result is that and continue using that. So this is super powerful because you don't have to maintain any of that state yourself. So you don't have to store a bunch of like temporary variables that are like, oh, this was the error of the results, and then this is the last successful, and then you don't have to like keep track of like clearing those out every time the user clicks the button again, and that kind of thing. That's all taken care of transparently. So yeah, so super, super powerful feature of that add-on. So there's a lot in this add-on that I can't really like explain with just words. So I'm gonna kind of walk through it, and there's actually a pretty good demo. It's not actually 404. Keynote just doesn't know what hash symbols are. So I just kind of want to show kind of how this works. So you know, in your typical application, if you used a task and you don't set any sort of constraints on it, you know, you might end up with like 7 things running at once, right? And like, who knows what happens when one finishes before the other one, like race conditions, that kind of thing. So you might want to put something on there that says restartable. So like, the next time I get this, just restart it. So a good example of this is like if you're doing like a type ahead and the user keeps typing, you don't want to like wait for all those previous requests for a search term to complete before you show them the latest one, because they really only care about what they last typed. So in this situation, like you have one running, and you start another one, it'll cancel the previous ones, and it'll manage that cancellation. So your app probably won't even know that something was canceled. And your users certainly won't know either. And you don't have to manage that process yourself at all, which is great. So another one is in queuing. So if you wanted people to continue like doing some sort of asynchronous activity, but not all at once, you could use in queue. And so you know, it'll wait for the first one to finish, and then it'll start doing the other ones. Sometimes, apparently, that chart doesn't work, so it won't. And then the one that I use most often is drop. So this is really good for like debouncing. I think the Wi-Fi might have cut out. So this will just, essentially, if there's already a task running, it'll ignore whatever new ones that you try to launch. So make sure that there's only one running. And then keep latest kind of explains itself. It'll do whatever is the current running one. Yeah, so that's kind of a good illustration of how that all works. This is Brandon's computer. I don't know what's going on. There we go. All right. So kind of the big majorly supported add-on, I think it's one of the only ones that the Ember core team maintains themselves, is Ember Data. And so Ember Data is kind of the de facto standard data management library that you'll use in your apps. It is very similar to you know, how ORMs work in the back end. So if you've used you know, Active Record in Rails, or what's the one that Java people use? Hibernate something? Okay, yeah. Yeah, similar to ORMs that you've probably worked with in other languages. A little bit different because it's, you know, front end and it's JSON objects and things like that. But essentially what it is providing this model abstraction on top of your API resources. So it's built around you know, REST or REST-ish API resources, and underneath it natively uses JSON API and structures the data the way that JSON API would. So if you're not familiar with the JSON API standard, it's a very clean way for doing these sorts of REST APIs and in a very standardized fashion. But you can use Ember Data with pretty much any sort of pattern that you have for your API. So if you have like a kind of standard Rails API, you can map it to active model sorts of responses, and if you have some sort of very custom thing that doesn't use standard URLs and stuff like that, you can write adapters and you can write serializers that will adapt to whatever structure your API is. And so the big thing that Ember Data does, besides providing this model abstraction, is it also provides a store abstraction so that you can fetch records from your APIs, and it'll cache that data, and you can kind of reuse it throughout your other applications. And it'll also establish relationships between data. So if you have one resource that depends on other resources, you can define those relationships, and it will do, depending on how you set it up, it can automatically fetch related resources and things like that without you having to manage all of that yourself, which can be very powerful if you set it up correctly, and very, very aggravating if your API is weird. So sometimes there are some gotchas. But overall, it's a good strategy for probably most applications. So there is Redux for Ember. There's a add-on that provides Redux bindings for Ember. It works with all the Redux middleware that you might use. So Redux Saga, Redux Dev Tools. It'll still do the timeline debugging or time travel debugging or whatever that does. It's fairly mature and well supported. I hear I've never really used Redux, so I don't actually have anything to show for this slide. But I figured there's a lot of React people at JavaScript Minnesota, so those of you who are already using something like Redux might find that to be a happy path forward if you're looking to introduce some Ember to your stack. And here's a picture of a puppy, because puppies are great. So you might be noticing a pattern with these add-ons, in that I'm referring to a lot of them as de facto standards, which I think is one of the really great things about Ember, is that there is a notion of a de facto standard. So like there is a community that's coming around sort of these tried and true solutions. And you don't have to spend your time choosing between 4 or 5 different libraries. Usually there's like one really, really good one, and then maybe 2 really, really good ones, and then some other smaller ones that no one uses. But so Ember SimpleAuth is kind of the one true library for doing authentication and session storage, which is kind of one of those things that you only want to have one of, because security is really hard. So having the whole community behind one solution for doing authentication in your app is super powerful. So it'll work with pretty much any like OAuth resource that you have. So if your company runs an OAuth server that provides the identities and things like that for your applications, it'll plug and play pretty well with that. You can plug it into using Devise on the Rails side. So this add-on is very similar. It's essentially the Ember component, or not component. It's the corresponding Ember library to something like Devise. And then you can also plug in these other popular social provider logins via an add-on to this add-on. And then it kind of does all the session state management and allows you to sort of define which areas of your app you want to be authenticated and things like that, and it'll just kind of handle most of that transparently after you get it set up, and it saves you a lot of headache. So there's a couple libraries that I use in pretty much every app for providing me these reusable helpers that are useful in pretty much any application. So one of those is Ember Composable helpers. And so what this is essentially Ember helpers for every array function that you'd probably want to use from like the JavaScript standard library. So your maps reduce, your filters, it'll have things for iterating on objects. So group by, which is super useful if you want to like group a certain piece of UI by a certain property, and you don't want to have to write a bunch of JavaScript code for that everywhere, like in every component that you use that. You can just use this directly in your template, and you've saved yourself, however many minutes of work. And it also has some really nice helpers for chaining actions. So, for instance, if you had a button that does a bunch of stuff, or it needs to do a bunch of stuff, but you don't want to have to like write a bunch of code for managing that stuff. You just want it to do three things, or do three things one right after the other. You could use the pipe helper or the queue helper if you wanted to enqueue certain things, like say send a message, then fetch the next or the latest messages, and then update the unread count in the UI. You could just do that directly in your template, and you wouldn't have to write any of that code. It's really useful for preventing a lot of duplication and stuff in your components. So there's a number of components that I have in my apps that look fairly complex, but there ends up not actually being any JavaScript code that I had to write for that component. It's mostly just these helpers that are in there. And that means I don't have to write tests for a bunch of JavaScript code, and I can just rely on this being a good thing to use, and it makes it a lot easier to change later. And another big thing is that it's declarable, like you can, or declarative. So you can look at the template and know, oh yeah, this is what's going on here. Like it's only showing the items that are marked as featured or something like that, because it's filtering on whatever collection I'm giving this component. And I don't have to go then look in another JavaScript file to see what's going on for some fairly boilerplate stuff. There's two kind of sibling add-ons to composable helpers, truth helpers and string helpers. So just kind of more of the same. If your logic functions, you want to be able to and stuff, or stuff, do other comparisons in the template without creating like another computed property or something like that. Those are indispensable, not indispensable. Yes. And then string helpers have your usual display kind of things that you want to do, like not showing underscores to your users is helpful. So another component that comes in handy a lot is Ember Wormhole. And it's not just because it has a cool name. So Ember Wormhole kind of sounds like the name, or kind of works like what the name is. You essentially define an area in your component, where you might use Ember Wormhole, and you tell it where it's going to take whatever content's in there and where it's going to put it. So in this example, I have a component called unhelpful Clippy, and I want to make sure that unhelpful Clippy shows up in the floating Clippy div, which is presumably somewhere else in my app that's not like directly in the control of whatever component is rendering it. So this is really helpful for doing things like modals and tooltips and things like that sort of exist at kind of like a higher layer, right? So, but you wouldn't want to have to manage all your modals in one central place, right? Because they usually depend on some sort of data that's contained within your component hierarchy, right? So like you might want to launch a modal when you click a list item, and it needs to have the data from that list item in it, but the modal still needs to take up most of the UI. You would use something like Ember Wormhole to essentially render it somewhere else up at the top level. And then it also provides some really useful stuff for testing this, so you can still render it in place for testing purposes. So, right? I like it. So I want to leave you guys with a mnemonic device that I came up with for remembering all your Ember fundamentals. It turns out letters are hard and words are confusing, so they're not great, but I don't know, it kind of makes sense. Have I convinced anyone with this? No? Okay. One or two. That's a win. Yeah, so actually that pretty much is it for my talk. I just want to give a shout out to Mike North. If you're not familiar with Mike North, he's he does JavaScript training stuff. He actually does training for front-end masters, so he has a number of talks with them. But Mike came out to Iora back in January for a couple days for a training session, because we are in the process of rewriting our main application in Ember, and he phenomenal job, really leveled up the whole team in just a couple days. So if the stuff I mentioned about Ember seems really interesting and compelling, and you find yourself playing around with it in the next few months, and you find that, hey, this would be really great to use in my company, but I want to really hit the ground running, you should talk to Mike. It's really great. And with that, happy dance. Cool. Yeah.
Questions for the camera?
Yeah.
Okay. I shall do that. Questions?
I guess I haven't really researched into this, but do you have a good impression of how utilized Ember is as a framework versus as far as where the direction is going compared to Angular 2, React, Vue? Is it something that's on the up and up with that sort of thing, or is it kind of still staying?
So it does have. So the question was, kind of what is the utilization of Ember compared to other frameworks? Ember is definitely not as popular in terms of number of users as say React. It is kind of on the up, but it's a very slow kind of slope, and it's kind of been at sort of the same levels that it's been at for the last few years. But I think there's a lot of really exciting stuff happening, and there's a lot of really great stuff that's coming in the future to Ember. So there's a lot of drive in the direction of making Ember components like real web components, and making it integrate better with sort of the native features of the web platform. And there's a lot of enthusiasm around making Ember something that you can kind of mix and match with other frameworks. So there's this idea of installing your way to the full framework that the core team is really interested in. So I talked a little bit, I mentioned Glimmer.js, which is basically the rendering engine of Ember extracted to its own library. So the idea is the Ember core team kind of wants to make those things available for use in other frameworks. So I think hopefully you'll be seeing more and more of it. But right now, yeah, it's still I think considered a little bit more niche to things like Angular and things like React.
It's not backed by one of the big companies that is 100% open source, or?
So it is considered community supported, but of the kind of two most prominent people in the core team, so one of them is Yehuda Katz, who runs a consulting company called Tilde, and so they're kind of they kind of do a lot of the stuff for Ember, like a lot of the organizing and things like that. But then kind of the other big person in Ember is Tom Dale, who now works for LinkedIn, and a number of other core team members work for LinkedIn. So LinkedIn has made a really huge investment into Ember. So if you've used LinkedIn in the last like 3 months, like that whole rewritten application, that's Ember. Intercom is also, I think, completely Ember. So they have a pretty big voice as well in the community, but it's not primarily backed by any large company, which I think is a feature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a bad thing. I was curious.
Yeah.
Thank you.
For sure. Yep.
I'll jump on that. So you said the cats items in the community as well, right?
Yep.
And you mentioned like block, like Ruby style blocks being similar to yield. Are there other syntactic similarities there, or is that kind of where it is?
So the question was, with Yehuda being involved in some of the semantics of handlebars templates, is there more that's kind of similar to Ruby? So handlebars was actually, I think, the first version was written by Yehuda, and it's used in Ember, so that's kind of why. And that's definitely based around the Ruby syntax. But I don't know if I'd say that anything else about Ember is necessarily Ruby-ish any more than modern JavaScript is kind of similar to Ruby in some ways, right? Yeah.
You mentioned you didn't like Babel, and I saw there are things for like filter and map. Is there any support for polyfills, or is that more kind of just do an add-on for Ember?
Oh yeah. So the question was around Babel and Ember. So Ember does use Babel, and it has a bunch of presets built into it. So like you can use async and await out of the box. You can include the polyfill too if you need to run it on older versions of browsers. That's, I think, a single line change. You just say Babel include polyfill in like this configuration file. And so that's really great. Like you get all the features of modern JavaScript, but without actually having to write any Babel config. And you can actually, in the latest versions of Ember CLI, I think you can target the Babel features to specific browser versions. So you can say, like, I want my app to be essentially compiled for the last X number of versions of Chrome and the last X number of versions of Firefox and whatever you want. So yeah. Side of the room at all? No? Bryce?
Kind of ties into this question, but what's the build process like for Ember? The batteries included build process?
Yeah, so there's 2 commands. Well, really 1 command for building an Ember CLI, and that is Ember build, and it'll build it. And you can pass it like environment. So like it supports multiple environments. So you can say build for production or build for development or build for staging or whatever. And then there's also there's Ember serve, which will it's kind of the watching build process, so it'll run the server and then keep rebuilding as your code changes and stuff like that.
Do you use Webpack underneath?
It does not use Webpack underneath. It uses Broccoli.js, but I think based on following Tom Dale on Twitter and seeing tweets of his every once in a while, it seems like he wants to replace it with Webpack ? Don't take that as gospel, but like maybe it'll happen. I don't know. Could be trolling. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Any more questions? Yes.
What was the number one aspect of Ember that enticed you to abandon your relationship with Angular?
So I mean, really, it was I started a new job and we used Ember and not Angular. And so then I started writing Ember, and I was like, oh, OK, I like this better. So yeah.
So one of my difficulties getting into front-end development beyond just basic stuff, like jQuery level stuff, has been, like, for example, getting into React, just all the different components beyond React itself, and have to learn and understand and put together a cohesive app. So like going back to the whole batteries included thing, do you feel like Ember is one of the better kind of one-stop solutions for putting together smaller, simple apps as far as what it includes, or is there a lot of other stuff that you eventually have to branch out into in order to integrate that?
Yeah, so the question was around ease of use of getting into Ember, and does it kind of solve the problems of sort of the more pick and choose.
if you will.
The what?
The JavaScript fatigue, if you will.
Yeah, the JavaScript fatigue, right? So I would say in my case, I did feel like it kind of solved that, but I think there is still a bit of a learning curve to getting into Ember because it's based around all these conventions. So so if you've come from like Rails or something like that, it will probably be a little bit easier to pick up, but it's not as there's a lot of stuff that's kind of like implicit and based around these conventions that you just kind of have to learn and get used to before you really feel like you can be productive with it.
I've used some backend frameworks like Laravel for PHP, so like I can appreciate the conventions and stuff like that. It's just I can kind of see where like some frameworks and technologies make it more flexible by imposing less convention, but that to me, starting out, is actually more confusing.
Yeah. I would say, yeah, your mileage will kind of vary based on the resources that you seek out for learning it. So like the quick start guides are a good place to start, but I think learning from talks was kind of what did it for me. Seeing actually people explain it and walk through some of the stuff is really important.
Cool. I think that's just about all the time we have right now. I'm going to stop the live stream in just a moment, or rather do one of these. But in the meantime, you all should clap for Max. Thanks for. Yeah, wow, that was awesome. Ember is, as you mentioned, a really sweet framework, and it's super cool to hear a deep dive into that. We're just going to wait for the slide to come up. Thanks again for everyone for coming out. These are the folks who made it happen. I'm the rambly one up there in the upper right-hand corner, who occasionally says words, some of them good ones. Robert too. Robert, I didn't see where you ran off to. He is around. He's around. Robert is awesome. You can find him on Twitter right around there. Anna Baker. Anna, are you still around? There we go, in the back right there. Nick DeLuca. Nick is still around, I believe, but there he is, also in the back. Oh my God. And then Randall Meeker, also in green, on the far right hand side. Thanks again from all of us for coming out here again. We do this stuff for you guys. So if you have any feedback about tonight's event, especially for our pals on the live stream there, which is still running, feel free to let us know either on Twitter or via meetup.com or any of the other various channels you've heard tonight. Other than that, thanks for coming by, and we'll see you all next time.
Be looking for a speaker if anyone is interested.
That is fair. We are looking